My name is Chloe Anderson. Pour yourself a warm cup of coffee, settle in, and let's have an honest conversation about what it feels like to have your entire worth measured strictly by your obedience. Have you ever felt like you were only valuable to your own family if you could be controlled? If you've ever had to quietly build your own strength in the dark while the people who were supposed to love you tried to tear you down, I want you to type the word boundaries in the comments right now. I read every single one of them, and today I want you to know that you are not alone. For almost a decade, my parents had treated me like the family's most embarrassing failure. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and polished contempt, completely convinced that I was a lost cause. They never asked what I did during the long, exhausting weeks I disappeared into complex corporate fraud cases, or cared that my supposedly boring office job had helped put high-profile thieves behind bars. To them, I was just the daughter with no real career, no future, and absolutely nothing worth respecting. They called me a failed investment because I didn't fit into the neat, predictable box they had designed for me. I was the runner-up, the disappointment, the one who didn't make the family look grand at dinner parties. They had no idea that while they were mocking my lifestyle, I was mastering the exact skills that would eventually dismantle their entire world. But back then, I kept my head down. I let them believe whatever version of me made them feel superior. I worked in the shadows, analyzing digital footprints, mapping out illicit financial transfers, and learning how to spot the exact moment a liar begins to panic. I thought my personal life and my professional life would always remain entirely separate. I hoped I could just love my family from a safe, quiet distance. Then, at exactly 7:42 on a crisp Thursday morning, my grandmother sent me 5 words. The blue roses are dying. To anyone else on this planet, it would have sounded like a harmless, slightly eccentric text from an elderly woman worrying about her garden. But to me, it was a chilling siren. It was the precise distress code we had meticulously created years earlier. A code she promised she would only activate if she was being actively controlled, threatened, or physically prevented from calling the authorities for help. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my training instantly took over. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when a fraudster is cornering a victim. I didn't text her back. I didn't call her phone to alert whoever might be standing over her shoulder. Instead, I immediately contacted emergency services while pulling on my heavy winter jacket, calmly explaining to the dispatcher exactly why an elderly, vulnerable woman was in immediate, extreme danger. Exactly 10 minutes later, the illusion of my family's quiet, respectable life was shattered. I stood directly on my parents' front porch, the morning wind stinging my face, with 2 uniformed police officers standing firmly beside me. I wasn't the timid, useless daughter they expected. I was the storm they never saw coming. My father, Brian, opened the heavy wooden door, his face instantly settling into the same amused, condescending expression he used whenever he called me useless. He looked past me at the uniform officers, his eyes narrowing slightly, but his voice remained perfectly steady, dripping with that smooth, executive confidence he had used to dominate our household for as long as I could remember. "Chloe," he said, adjusting the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater. "What on earth is this? Did you lose your apartment keys again? Or are you just bringing your dramatic flair to our doorstep before breakfast?" He didn't look like a man who had just spent the last 2 weeks systematically cutting an old woman off from the world. He looked like an annoyed, respectable homeowner dealing with an eccentric daughter. But I knew the signs. I had spent years analyzing the subtle microexpressions of people who thought they were the smartest in the room. I noticed the way his left hand subtly clenched into a fist against his thigh and how his eyes darted toward the driveway to see if any neighbors were watching. My mother, Diana, appeared right behind him. She was the picture of upper-middle-class poise, her hair perfectly styled even at this hour. But unlike my father, her composure slipped for a fraction of a second. She was tightly gripping my grandmother's phone in her left hand, and her right arm was awkwardly pinning a thick blue folder of legal papers against her side. Neither of them looked truly frightened until the taller officer, Sergeant Elena Ruiz, stepped forward and asked to see my grandmother alone. Then my father's practiced smile completely vanished. The color drained from his lips, and my mother stepped backward into the dim light of the foyer. In that exact moment of heavy, suffocating silence, a muffled, metallic crash echoed from the locked room at the very end of the hallway. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the floorboards, followed by a faint, desperate scraping noise. I was 18, standing on this exact porch in the freezing rain, staring at two massive suitcases my father had dragged out of the house. "You want to go to a university we can't monitor?" He had sneered, blocking the doorway while my mother stood silently behind him. "Then you are no longer an investment worth making. Disobedience is the ultimate proof of an ungrateful child." Snap back to the present. I wasn't that trembling 18-year-old girl anymore. I looked directly into my father's eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a terrifying authority figure. I saw a small, panicked fraudster running out of time. "Brian," I said, my voice completely flat, completely devoid of the anger he always used to weaponize against me. "Move away from the hallway." He stared at me as if I had spoken in a completely foreign language. He wasn't used to me using his first name, and he certainly wasn't used to me issuing commands. My mother recovered her footing faster. With a practiced, elegant movement, she set Grandma's phone face down on the console table and turned to the officers with a look of deeply polished, maternal concern. "Officers, please excuse my daughter," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, sorrowful cadence that sounded incredibly authentic. "This is a terrible misunderstanding. My mother has advanced dementia, and Chloe has always been an incredibly unstable, dramatic girl who seeks attention. We are doing our best to care for an elderly woman, and Chloe is turning our family's private pain into a public spectacle." The lie was delivered so smoothly, so flawlessly, that for one dangerous, lingering second, the entire scene looked exactly the way my parents wanted it to look. It looked like two exhausted, selfless caregivers being harassed by a resentful, unhinged daughter. If I hadn't spent 12 years investigating staged insurance claims and identifying high-level manipulation techniques, I might have backed down. I knew this strategy inside and out. Give people a simple, comforting narrative before they have the time to study the actual evidence, and the majority of people will accept it simply because simplicity feels like the truth. They wanted the officers to see a family tragedy, not a financial crime. But the lock on the door down the hall was about to tell a completely different story. A second, sharper crash vibrated through the floorboards from the locked room at the end of the hall. It was the definitive sound of wood splintering, followed by a faint, raspy cough. Officer Grant didn't wait for my father's permission. He moved past Brian with a swift, authoritative stride, his heavy boots clicking against the hardwood. He stopped in front of the guest room door, his eyes immediately dropping to the outside of the frame. There, installed hastily into the pristine white trim, was a heavy brass deadbolt lock. The key was still sitting quietly in the cylinder, accessible only to someone standing in the hallway. Grant turned the key, the mechanism clicking open with a loud, metallic snap, and pushed the door wide. My grandmother, Ava Anderson, was sitting on the hardwood floor beside a heavily overturned oak chair. Despite the suffocating summer heat trapping the air inside the unventilated room, she was wearing a thick, knitted gray cardigan. As she looked up at the sudden intrusion of light, one of her sleeves slid back slightly, revealing a deep, purple bruise wrapped like a tight collar around her frail wrist. Scattered across the floor near her bare feet was a chaotic stack of financial papers, each page heavily marked with bright yellow plastic tabs. She didn't cry out. She didn't look confused. She looked directly past the uniformed officer, found my eyes in the crowded hallway, and slowly pressed two fingers firmly against her heart. That small, deliberate motion was our long-established confirmation signal. It was the silent language we had developed over late-night tea years ago. It told me everything I needed to know in a fraction of a second. She had sent the code intentionally. She was entirely lucid. She was not suffering from a sudden bout of dementia, and she was not confused by the flashing lights outside her window. My mother, Diana, rushed forward, her heels clicking aggressively as she tried to squeeze past the officers. "Ava, oh my goodness! Look what you've done to yourself!" she cried, her voice pitching into a forced theatrical panic. "We told you not to try and stand up without us, officers, you see. She wanders, she falls." "Ma'am, please remain exactly where you are in the living room," Sergeant Ruiz interrupted, her arm extending like a steel bar across the doorway, physically blocking my mother's advance. Behind us, my father's voice began rising, talking loudly over everyone else in the room. He was attempting to flood the environment with noise, a psychological tactic designed to overwhelm an investigator's focus. He claimed Ava had simply fallen, that the deadbolt was installed purely because she had a dangerous habit of wandering into the street at night, and that the dark bruise on her wrist was nothing more than the natural side effect of her heavy blood thinners. Then, turning his gaze toward me, his eyes spitting venom, he shouted that I had deliberately manipulated a vulnerable, elderly woman because I was greedy and wanted to secure a larger share of her inheritance. I watched him quietly, letting my analytical training act as an emotional shield. He was building legal defenses before anyone in the room had even formally accused him of a crime. It was a glaring behavioral red flag. I noticed it immediately, and based on the subtle shift in her posture, so did Sergeant Ruiz. I stepped into the room, bypassing my parents entirely, and knelt down on the floor beside Grandma, being careful not to disturb or touch any of the scattered financial papers around her feet. "Are you hurt, Grandma?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice low and soothing. "My wrist," she said, her voice small but entirely steady as she looked at the dark mark. Then, her eyes shifted to her own daughter and son-in-law standing in the hallway. "And they would not let me leave this room, Chloe. They took my keys. They took my life." In that exact moment, the entire atmosphere of the house shifted permanently. The two officers stopped treating the call as a routine, annoying family disagreement and instantly began treating the pristine suburban home as an active potential crime scene. Officer Grant pulled out a compact digital camera and began systematically photographing the external lock from multiple angles. Sergeant Ruiz knelt down on the other side of Ava, gently asking her whether she required immediate medical attention and whether she felt safe speaking with us while her daughter and son-in-law were still in the house. Grandma looked Ruiz directly in the eye. She said yes to the first question and a clear, unwavering no to the second. From the hallway, my mother called that statement absolutely ridiculous. My father called it an outright betrayal. But as I watched them through the doorframe, I realized something deeply unsettling. Neither of them asked whether Grandma was actually in pain. They didn't ask if she needed a glass of water or if her hip, which had recently been operated on, was re-injured in the fall. They were entirely consumed by the sudden fracture in their own defense strategy. As the paramedics were summoned to the house, Sergeant Ruiz efficiently separated all of us to prevent any further collusion or intimidation. I was instructed to stand near the large front window in the living room, while Officer Grant escorted my parents into the kitchen for formal questioning. The house was quiet enough that through the open kitchen doorway, I could easily hear my mother's voice rising in a desperate, bitter crescendo. She described me to the officer as entirely unemployed, deeply resentful of their lifestyle, and completely obsessed with true crime stories. She painted a picture of a broken, vindictive daughter trying to tear down a respectable household out of sheer jealousy. Diana had absolutely no idea that I was legally licensed as an investigator in 3 states, that I led incredibly complex, multi-million-dollar fraud investigations for a massive national insurer, or that I had repeatedly testified in federal court as a certified expert witness. My parents had decided exactly who I was over a decade ago. They had constructed a convenient fiction of my failure, and they automatically rejected every single fact, promotion, or credential that threatened the comfortable role they had assigned me. Meanwhile, Grandma was being gently examined by a paramedic in the guest room, with the door purposely left wide open so Ruiz could monitor her statements. In a calm, clear voice, Ava began dismantling the past 8 months of her life. She explained that Brian and Diana had suddenly moved into her house under the guise of wanting to help her recover from a difficult hip surgery. At first, the arrangement seemed like a blessing. They drove her to her medical appointments, organized her complex medications, and prepared meals. But then, the walls began to close in. They systematically began opening her private mail. They changed the passwords on her online banking accounts without her permission, canceled long-standing weekly lunches with her closest friends, and began telling extended relatives over the phone that she was becoming frighteningly forgetful and losing her mind. 2 weeks earlier, my father had taken her to a completely unknown notary public and pressured her into signing thick legal documents that she wasn't even allowed to read. Then, on that very morning, Diana had marched into her room, demanding yet another signature on a fresh set of papers. When Ava flatly refused to sign her name blindly again, they violently snatched her phone from her hands and locked her inside the room. Ruiz paused, writing in her notebook, and asked why she hadn't tried to call for help or alert anyone sooner. Grandma looked through the doorway, her eyes locking onto mine, with an intensity that broke my heart. "Because," Grandma whispered, her voice trembling slightly for the first time, "I needed them to believe that Chloe knew absolutely nothing about what was happening in this house. If they thought she was looking, they would have hidden the trails. I needed them to think they were entirely safe." Brian heard her statement through the long hallway, and his sharp executive expression instantly hardened. He stepped toward the kitchen threshold, his eyes boring into Grandma. "What on earth does that mean? What trails?" Grandma didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. Instead, she turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. "Chloe, go out to the front porch right now. Retrieve the blue ceramic planter sitting beside the steps." My mother tried to step forward to block the front door, but Officer Grant firmly placed his hand on his belt, issuing a sharp verbal warning that forced her back. I walked out onto the porch, my boots echoing in the morning air. I approached the heavy blue ceramic planter, emptied the loose soil from its false bottom, and found exactly what Grandma had hidden. It was a small, heavy brass key wrapped tightly inside a folded business card. The card bore the name of an elite elder law attorney based downtown, Leo Marston. And on the back of the card, written in Grandma's distinct, precise, elegant handwriting, were 3 separate bank account numbers and a single equal, chilling sentence. If the code is used, open the red box before anyone has the chance to explain it away. As I walked back into the foyer holding the key, my mother completely lost her composure. She lunged forward across the living room, her fingers clawing toward the card in my hand. Officer Grant moved like lightning, stepping between us and physically stopping her before her fingers could even graze my sleeve. The sudden, violent movement was fast enough to completely expose what her calm, polished voice had spent the morning hiding. She wasn't worried about an old woman's supposed confusion or dementia. She was absolutely terrified of the information trapped inside that key. The paramedics gently loaded Grandma onto a gurney, recommending she be taken to the hospital immediately for a full evaluation of her wrist and a baseline physical exam. Sergeant Ruiz walked alongside them, turning to my parents with a cold, professional look. She informed them that Ava was leaving the property entirely voluntarily and that any attempt to interfere with her departure or follow her to the facility could result in an immediate arrest for obstruction. My father turned to face me, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes dark with absolute disbelief. "You brought the police into your own family's home," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and wounded pride. I looked at him, completely unmoved. "No," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Grandma brought them here when you made this house unsafe for her." As they wheeled the gurney toward the waiting ambulance, Grandma caught my hand in hers. Her grip was physically weak, but her eyes were piercingly clear, completely devoid of the fog my mother had tried to claim was there. "The red box is not in this house, Chloe," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "It's safe, and Kevin cannot know you found the key." A chill ran straight down my spine. Kevin was my younger brother, the golden child my parents had spent a lifetime praising as everything I was not. He was a certified public accountant. He handled Grandma's complex annual taxes, and he had direct, authorized access to every single one of her financial accounts. Until that exact harrowing moment on the driveway, I had not known whether he was actively helping my parents strip her assets, or whether he was the single person Grandma feared most on this earth. At the hospital, Grandma was immediately placed in a secure, private room, while an experienced adult protective services social worker began documenting the dark bruise on her wrist. The social worker systematically asked her the same basic questions in 3 different ways to formally establish her mental baseline. What year was it? Who was currently the president? Why exactly had she come to the hospital today? Who held ultimate control over her money? Ava answered every single question with flawless, sharp precision until the social worker gently asked whether she still trusted her own son. Grandma paused, looking toward the heavy, closed wooden door of the examination room. Her lower lip trembled just a bit, but her voice was steady. "I trusted him entirely with my physical recovery," she said quietly. "And he treated that sacred trust like a blank check." I sat silently in the plastic chair beside her bed, my mind continuously replaying my father's face, the moment Grandma had mentioned the red box to the officers. That desperate, cornered expression instantly reminded me of the exact night I left home at 18. Had returned past midnight from an elite, out-of-state university scholarship interview, only to find my heavy canvas suitcases sitting on the front porch. Brian had accused me of deeply humiliating his authority by applying to a school he could not financially control. Diana stood directly behind him in the foyer, crossing her arms, and whispered that a long, cold silence would eventually teach me true gratitude. Grandma Ava had arrived before midnight that night, loaded my heavy bags into the trunk of her car, and gave me a safe, quiet place to sleep for the next 4 years. She never once told me to just swallow my pride or forgive them. Instead, she looked at me over a cup of tea and told me to become so fiercely independent that their approval could never again function as a leash on my soul. Years later, after I successfully investigated a massive corporate fraud case involving an elderly policyholder whose own nephew had stolen her digital identity, Grandma and I sat down and created our private emergency code. Blue roses were her absolute favorite flowers, and the word dying meant she was in immediate physical danger. We practiced the protocol exactly. Call for a formal welfare check, avoid warning the suspected abuser at all costs, preserve all digital messages, and let her speak entirely for herself when the authorities arrived. I had desperately hoped the plan would remain nothing more than one of those cautious, hypothetical promises families make and never actually need. Now, looking at the purple marks on her skin, I understood exactly why she had insisted on it. Before the doctor could even finish examining her wrist, my smartphone buzzed aggressively in my hand. Kevin's name flashed across the screen. I took a deep breath, answered the call, and deliberately kept my mouth shut about the brass key in my pocket. "What on earth did you just do, Chloe?" he demanded immediately. His voice wasn't screaming. It was low, intensely controlled, and far more frightening than shouting. "Dad just called me. He says you dragged Grandma out of her own home with a squad car." "Grandma explicitly asked the police for help, Kevin," I said calmly. "She is not confused. She knew our private distress code perfectly." There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear him breathing heavily. "You always desperately wanted to be the family hero, Chloe," he said, his tone dripping with bitterness. "Do not turn our private family business into one of your corporate fraud cases." The call went dead before I could even ask him where he was currently located. Seconds later, a sharp chime signaled a new email on my phone. It was an official correspondence from a high-profile law firm representing my parents. They were planning to seek an immediate emergency guardianship over Ava the very next morning, formally claiming that she completely lacked mental capacity and that I was actively exploiting her paranoia. Attached to the email was a raw draft of the legal petition, explicitly describing me as financially unstable, emotionally volatile, and completely estranged from the family dynamic. The formal filing included signed, sworn statements from Brian, Diana, and my brother Kevin. For years, being called useless by them had deeply hurt because some foolish, lingering part of me still hoped they might look closely enough to discover they were wrong about me. But reading that legal petition completely changed the nature of the wound. Their contempt was no longer merely cruel family banter. It had officially become a targeted legal weapon. They were actively trying to transform the false identity they had invented for me into concrete legal evidence to strip an old woman of her rights. Have you ever wondered how many toxic family lies survive only because the person being targeted is too deeply ashamed to stand up and challenge them? I had been paralyzed by that exact shame for years. But that afternoon, sitting in that sterile hospital room, the shame evaporated completely. I picked up my phone and called Leo Marston. Leo Marston answered my call on the very first ring, his voice calm and entirely unbothered by the sudden legal escalation. He instructed me to bring the brass key directly to his office the moment Grandma's formal capacity evaluation was complete. He didn't sound even remotely surprised by my parents' aggressive countermove. "Chloe," he said over the line, "Ava explicitly instructed me months ago not to contact you or reveal her preparations unless she activated that specific distress code. She was adamant about it. She wanted your emotional reaction on that porch to be completely genuine. And she wanted their abusive behavior to remain entirely unguarded until the trap was sprung. Leo's office occupied the quiet second floor of a beautifully converted historic stone courthouse near the downtown district. When I arrived, my closest friend, Sophia Reed, was already waiting for me in the wood-paneled lobby. Sophia was a brilliant specialist in advanced digital forensics and data recovery. She had partnered with me on dozens of high-stakes corporate insurance cases involving heavily altered financial documents and hidden, encrypted asset transfers. Unlike my family, who refused to look past their own convenient fiction, Sophia knew exactly what I did for a living. She respected my mind, and she also knew exactly when not to insult me with empty, comforting platitudes. As we quietly climbed the creaking mahogany stairs together, her face was grim. If Kevin signed his name to their emergency guardianship petition, "Chloe," she whispered, adjusting her laptop bag, "you have to operate under the assumption that every single financial account his accounting firm touched has been deeply compromised." Leo locked his heavy office door firmly behind us, ensuring complete privacy, and placed a rugged, red steel security box directly onto the center of the conference table. My small brass key slid into the lock smoothly and turned with a satisfying, heavy click. Inside the box lay the meticulously organized architecture of a counter-investigation. It contained certified copies of Ava's original, unaltered will, recent independent medical evaluations confirming her absolute mental competence, certified bank statements, property deeds, and a dense, handwritten timeline beginning exactly 8 months earlier. Every single entry in Grandma's elegant cursive recorded a specific systematic restriction my parents had imposed on her life. Intercepted mail, canceled medical appointments, missing family jewelry, unexplained cash withdrawals, and horrific emotional threats carefully disguised as parental concern. The final page of her log detailed a massive, unauthorized transfer of exactly $186,400 from Ava's primary savings account directly into a shell limited liability company completely controlled by Brian and Diana. But beneath the mountain of paperwork lay a compact digital voice recorder and a sealed white envelope addressed specifically to me. I opened the envelope first, my hands trembling slightly as I recognized her handwriting. "Chloe, if you are reading these words, it means they have officially moved from psychological persuasion to physical force. Do not try to rescue me by becoming reckless. Follow the evidence. Trust Sophia. Trust Leo. And do not trust Kevin until he openly tells you about the basement account." Sophia read the last line over my shoulder twice, her brow furrowing. Leo's face tightened significantly. We checked every folder, but absolutely no document or bank statement in the red steel box made any mention of something called a basement account. I immediately called Kevin's cell phone again, but just like before, the call went directly to his automated voicemail. Then Sophia pressed the play button on the digital voice recorder. My mother's voice instantly filled the quiet room, sounding incredibly calm, cold, and unmistakable. "Once the emergency guardianship is officially approved by the judge, she can object all she wants," Diana's recorded voice said smoothly. "No one listens to a word an old woman says after a court of law formally declares her mentally incompetent." My father's voice answered her immediately, dripping with a terrifyingly calculated satisfaction. "And the best part is, Chloe will help us build our case without even knowing it." Brian laughed. "Every single time she loses her temper, every time she gets emotional or screams at us, she simply proves our legal argument for us. We just need to keep pushing her buttons until she snaps." Sophia stopped the recording, the silence in the room suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. I sat perfectly still, staring at the little black device. They hadn't simply underestimated my career. They had been actively, deliberately provoking me on purpose for years. They were collecting my natural emotional reactions to their cruelty, waiting for me to lose my composure so they could present my anger to a judge as definitive proof of the emotional instability they had described in their legal paperwork. The realization washed over me like ice water, freezing away the very last drop of my childhood hurt. The next confrontation could not be emotional. It could not involve shouting or tears. It had to be designed with the cold, sterile precision of a corporate fraud investigation. And this time, I would be the one deciding exactly what they were allowed to see. We had exactly 22 hours left before the emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled to take place. Leo immediately began dividing the legal and analytical work with the clinical precision of someone who understood that panic is a useless waste of time. He would immediately file Ava's recent independent medical evaluation, request the court appoint a completely neutral guardian ad litem, and seek an immediate emergency freeze on all disputed financial accounts. Sophia's task was to legally authenticate the metadata of the audio files and digitally compare the altered banking documents with the originals we had uncovered. My assignment was to build a comprehensive forensic transaction map, tracing exactly where every single dollar of Grandma's life savings had gone. Ava's only assignment was to rest safely in her hospital bed and prepare to tell the absolute truth in her own words. But my parents were arrogant, and they did not wait for the courtroom to continue their game. At exactly 6:15 that evening, my mother arrived at the hospital corridor, accompanied by a private, high-priced memory specialist she had hired, loudly demanding immediate physical access to Ava. The on-duty floor nurse flatly refused to let her pass, because Grandma had already formally removed both of my parents from her approved visitor list earlier that afternoon. Diana immediately took up a position directly in the center of the corridor, positioned perfectly where a prominent hospital security camera could capture her movements, and began weeping hysterically. She cried out for anyone to hear that I had poisoned a vulnerable old woman's mind against her own loving family. My father stood right beside her, filming the entire orchestrated scene on his smartphone, shouting down the hall, asking me why I was hiding Grandma in the dark if I truly had nothing to fear. The trap was incredibly obvious. They desperately wanted my anger. They wanted a raised voice, a threatening step, a defensive shout, anything they could easily crop, replay, and present to the judge tomorrow without any context. The 18-year-old version of me would have stood in that hallway and shouted back until my throat hurt, completely falling into their trap. But the 35-year-old senior examiner calmly walked out into the corridor, reached into my coat, and pulled out my official corporate investigator identification card. I calmly stated for the record that Miss Ava Anderson had legally requested total privacy, and I formally asked the hospital's security team to document the attempted unapproved contact on their logs. I did not insult them. I did not defend my painful childhood. I did not give them a single syllable of the unstable version of me they had so thoroughly rehearsed for. My father's face darkened as he realized I wasn't biting. He lowered his phone just enough to step into my personal space, moving close enough that only I could hear his whisper. "You actually think wearing a shiny little plastic badge from some generic insurance company makes you important, Chloe?" "It is not a badge, Brian," I said, looking him dead in the eye, my voice entirely level. "And personal importance has absolutely nothing to do with what is about to happen to you. We can easily have you mentally evaluated by the court, too," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. Leo Marston cannot protect someone who is legally certified as unstable. For a split second, the sterile white hospital hallway completely disappeared, and I was 18 again, standing helplessly beside my canvas suitcases while he explained that my disobedience was the ultimate proof of my ingratitude. The toxic memory arrived with a sudden wave of heat, but I simply stood there and let the feeling pass without obeying its impulse. That was the ultimate difference between simply remembering past pain and being actively controlled by it. "Threat formally noted, Brian," I replied clearly, looking directly up at the security camera above his head. His eyes flickered toward the lens, a sudden twitch appearing in his jaw. He had come to the hospital expecting a desperate family fight, but instead, he had just handed me a permanent, documented record of intimidation. The next morning, the emergency guardianship hearing took place in a small wood-paneled courtroom that smelled intensely of old paper and stale coffee. My parents sat directly behind their high-priced attorney, dressed in meticulously tailored, expensive clothes, flawlessly presenting themselves to the bench as deeply responsible, long-suffering caregivers. My brother Kevin sat quietly in the second row, his hands tightly folded in his lap. He looked straight ahead, completely refusing to meet my gaze. Grandma appeared via a secure video link directly from her private hospital room, looking remarkably alert, calm, and composed. Their attorney opened the proceedings by confidently describing me as an estranged, volatile daughter with highly irregular, mysterious employment and a long, documented history of family conflict. He boldly claimed that I had suddenly returned after years of limited contact solely to remove Ava from her safe home and position myself to illicitly influence her substantial estate. As the lawyer spoke, my father lowered his head at all the right moments, feigning deep sorrow. Diana gently dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. To seal the argument, Kevin submitted his signed, sworn statement, formally claiming he had observed increasing severe confusion in Grandma during their recent financial meetings. Then Leo Marston stood up. With complete composure, he introduced Ava's flawless capacity assessment from the hospital, her original estate documents, the official medical reports, crisp photographs of the external deadbolt lock, and the authenticated digital distress message. He calmly explained to the judge that I had not taken control of a single one of Grandma's accounts, nor was I named as her financial agent. Finally, he turned toward the bench to formally correct the record regarding my professional life. "Your Honor, Ms. Anderson is not casually or irregularly employed," Leo said, his voice echoing clearly through the quiet room. "She is a senior special investigations examiner with 12 years of specialized experience in financial fraud, elder exploitation indicators, document analysis, and coordinated criminal referrals to law enforcement. She has provided expert sworn testimony in 6 major civil proceedings and 2 federal criminal prosecutions." My father turned toward me so quickly, his heavy wooden chair creaked loudly against the floorboards. Diana's mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. Their stunned attorney stammered for a moment, then aggressively asked whether I had deliberately concealed my elite career from my own family. Leo didn't even let me answer. "They simply never cared to ask," he said flatly. "But more importantly, her impressive resume does not determine Miss Ava Anderson's competence or consent. That distinction matters, Your Honor. Abuse does not suddenly become acceptable just because the witness lacks prestigious credentials. Grandma deserved protection even if my client had truly been unemployed, uncertain, or ordinary." The judge didn't need to hear anything more. She instantly denied my parents' request for immediate emergency guardianship. She appointed a completely neutral temporary fiduciary, strictly prohibited any changes to Ava's estate, ordered the absolute preservation of all financial records, and restricted Brian and Diana from contacting her outside of legal counsel. But as the judge began signing the orders, my parents' attorney dropped a ticking clock bomb. He disclosed that a massive home equity loan secured against Grandma's primary property was already fully approved and scheduled to automatically fund at exactly 4 that afternoon. The corporate lender had already accepted a power of attorney bearing Ava's clear signature. If those digital documents were allowed to process, another $240,000 would completely disappear into the wind before our financial freeze could reach the institution. I checked the digital clock on the courtroom wall. We had exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes left. Outside the courtroom doors, my father completely lost his polished, executive expression, his face twisted with rage as he cornered me near the elevators. "You always ruin absolutely everything, Chloe," he hissed. I looked at him, and I almost laughed out loud at the tragic familiarity of it. When I was powerless as a child, I had been labeled entirely useless. Now that I was highly effective and protecting an innocent woman, I was labeled destructive. Their accusation changed whenever control changed. Kevin walked past both of us without speaking a single word. 10 minutes later, while Leo was frantically trying to get through to the lender's corporate legal department, a sharp vibration buzzed in my hand. A text message from a completely unknown number appeared on my screen. It contained a crisp photograph of a weathered gray filing cabinet hidden deep in Grandma's basement, accompanied by 6 words: "Bottom drawer, false back, come alone." Sophia studied the metadata of the image over my shoulder. "That could be Kevin genuinely trying to help us," she warned, her eyes narrowing. "Or it could be a trap designed to lead you somewhere private without any witnesses." A second message immediately chimed from the same number. "The basement account is not a bank account. It is what Dad calls the hidden physical records he thinks no one will ever find. The home equity transfer is still actively moving. The court order hasn't hit their system yet. They know you are closing in." My parents knew the walls were shutting down on them, and the only person offering me a shortcut to stop the transaction was the exact brother who had just signed a sworn statement against Grandma in a court of law. But I didn't go alone. That was the very first rule of professional investigative work my parents had never understood. True courage is not the same thing as making yourself incredibly easy to trap. Grandma Ava quickly provided written permission for me to enter her property, while Leo officially notified Sergeant Ruiz of the developing situation. Sophia waited in a running car directly across the street from the house, maintaining a live, encrypted location link to my phone. Ruiz could not legally search the premises without a formal warrant, but she firmly agreed to remain nearby with detectives while they reviewed the evolving financial evidence we had already gathered. The suburban house looked completely ordinary when I returned, which made the heavy external lock on the guest room door feel even more obscene. Abuse rarely announces itself with broken windows and dramatic, terrifying warnings. Sometimes it lives quietly behind perfectly clean curtains, smiling family photographs, and explanations that sound entirely reasonable until someone actually checks the facts. The basement smelled heavily of damp concrete and laundry detergent. I navigated through the shadows and found the gray filing cabinet tucked behind a stacked pile of holiday decorations. The bottom drawer appeared completely empty, but the metal panel at the very back shifted with a sharp click when I firmly pressed one corner. Behind it sat 3 thick binders, a black laptop, a notary stamp, and a portable document scanner. One binder contained direct copies of Ava's bank statements with handwritten notes showing massive transfers to companies I instantly recognized from our transaction map. Another held completely blank medical authorization forms and several loose pages bearing practiced, forged versions of Grandma's signature. The third binder was explicitly labeled family contingencies. Inside were printed emails discussing exactly how to handle each person who might try to interfere with their plans. One page described Grandma's closest friend as incredibly easy to discourage. Another proposed telling her local church that she had become completely paranoid and senile. My dedicated page was significantly longer. Brian had carefully listed old childhood arguments, periods when I worked out of state, and every personal insult that had ever successfully made me react. At the bottom of the page, Diana had written, "Keep calling her unsuccessful. She needs to prove herself, and people who need to prove themselves make mistakes." I read that sentence twice, the cold words sinking in. It was deeply painful, but it was also profoundly clarifying. Their cruelty had never been careless or random. They had consciously studied my emotional wound and pressed it whenever they required complete control over me. A floorboard creaked loudly directly above me. I closed the binder immediately and sent Sophia our pre-arranged emergency signal. Footsteps descended the wooden stairs slowly. Kevin appeared at the bottom of the steps, holding both of his hands up, where I could easily see them. "You brought someone," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You told me to come alone." "I needed to know whether you still acted entirely before thinking, Kevin," I said, my voice cutting through the damp air. "That version of me exists mainly in Dad's paperwork, not in reality." He flinched at my words. For the very first time in our lives, he looked significantly less like the golden child and far more like the terrified younger brother who used to wait outside my bedroom door after our parents fought. He sat down heavily on the lowest wooden step and confessed that the basement account began as Brian's private nickname for financial records he purposely kept entirely off computers. Kevin had discovered the cabinet while preparing Grandma's annual taxes. By then, he had already blindly helped them create 2 limited liability companies because Brian claimed they were part of a legitimate estate strategy. When Kevin finally questioned the massive transfers, Diana had sharply reminded him that his own accounting firm had officially processed the filings. Su'u. If he dared to expose them, he would lose his professional license and face an immediate criminal investigation himself. "So, you signed their guardianship statement anyway," I said flatly. "I repeated exactly what they told me to say," he whispered, looking at the concrete floor. "I did see Grandma forget small things occasionally, but I deliberately ignored every single time she was perfectly clear, because that made my part easier to live with." "Why warn her about the box then?" "I didn't," Kevin admitted, his voice breaking. "She caught me secretly copying these records from the cabinet. I thought she would expose me instantly. Instead, she looked at me and said, 'I still have time to decide what kind of man I want to be.'" Kevin opened the black laptop. The system password was a date only our immediate family knew. The exact day Grandma had taken both of us into her home after Brian had violently thrown me out at 18. On the hard drive were scanned deeds, altered wills, hidden recordings of remote notary sessions, and a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking exactly $426,000 taken or pledged against Ava's personal assets. The final column listed intended payments scheduled after the home equity loan funded. Heavy credit card debt, a luxury vehicle, Kevin's own business loan, and a massive cash deposit on a luxury condominium in Florida. His name was right there on the sheet. He had not merely been threatened by our parents. He had actively expected to profit from the theft. Tell me the whole truth, Kevin, I said, staring at the screen. Not the polished version that makes you feel forgivable. He swallowed hard and admitted he had already accepted $38,000 of the stolen money. He claimed he fully planned to repay it eventually, but the financial timing proved otherwise. I felt a deep, familiar anger rise in my chest, not only because he had completely betrayed Grandma, but because some foolish, hopeful part of me had desperately wanted at least one sibling relationship left untouched by our parents' toxicity. Would you forgive someone who finally told the truth only after realizing the lie was about to destroy them too? I didn't know the answer. I only knew that forgiveness and absolute accountability were not opposites. I immediately called Leo. Kevin retained separate legal counsel on the spot and agreed to fully surrender the laptop, testify openly about the shell companies, and provide full access credentials to the authorities. In exchange, prosecutors would decide later whether his sudden cooperation justified legal leniency. No one promised him immunity. At exactly 3:41 p.m., Leo successfully sent the corporate lender definitive proof that the power of attorney had been forged and that the physical notary seal found in the basement matched the seal on the loan package perfectly. The lender officially suspended the funding exactly 19 minutes before the final deadline. My phone rang almost immediately. Brian didn't even bother to greet me. "You went into that basement," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous purr. "The house belongs to Grandma. You have absolutely no idea what you just started, Chloe." Behind his voice, I could clearly hear Diana shouting hysterically and drawers slamming shut in the background. They knew the transfer had failed, and they knew someone had revealed the hidden cabinet. Then Brian lowered his voice to a whisper. "Bring back the laptop by 6 p.m., or your grandmother will learn exactly what happens when families choose sides." The threat was vague enough to deny later, but specific enough to understand perfectly. I recorded the call, forwarded it directly to Sergeant Ruiz, and looked over at Kevin. He whispered, "They have another digital copy of the files, and tonight they are meeting the exact person who helped them create it." The meeting was scheduled for exactly 8:00 that night. Kevin had learned the location from a frantic message Diana sent before she realized he had switched sides completely. My parents planned to meet Miles Voss, the corrupt mobile notary whose seal appeared on the forged power of attorney. They believed Kevin still had the original laptop and wanted him to exchange it for enough cash to disappear before the investigation widened any further. By 6 p.m., detectives obtained a comprehensive search warrant based on the forged signatures, the basement records, and Brian's recorded telephonic threat. Because Grandma owned the house, she also provided full legal consent to record the common areas. Sergeant Ruiz firmly asked me to stay back at the command vehicle. I flatly refused to interfere with active police work, but I also refused to let Kevin face them without someone present who understood the financial documents inside out. We compromised. I would sit quietly in the dining room, visible if unarmed, while officers monitored the environment from nearby rooms. 2 hours before the meeting, Sophia cloned the laptop and created a completely harmless copy containing only the specific files police wanted my parents to discuss. 1 hour before, Leo reviewed every single question Kevin could safely ask without sounding rehearsed. 30 minutes before, Grandma called directly from the rehabilitation center. "I want to be there, Chloe," she said, her voice steady. "No," I said. The answer came far too quickly. I heard my own deep fear disguised as authority. "Chloe?" Grandma said gently, cutting through my panic. "Protecting me does not mean deciding for me. I am not an object to be hidden." That stopped me cold. My parents had justified every single restriction in her life by claiming it was purely for her safety. I could not imitate their toxic control simply because my intentions were better. Ruiz quickly arranged for Grandma to wait with a victim advocate in a secure room nearby until the scene was entirely stable. At exactly 7:58 p.m., Brian and Diana entered through the back door. Miles followed closely behind, carrying a heavy leather case. They found Kevin sitting at the table with the copied laptop and me sitting completely still opposite him. Diana's face tightened instantly. Why on earth is she here? Because I know exactly what the files mean, I said calmly. Brian laughed, but the sound lacked any real confidence. Our little insurance clerk finally feels important. Kevin cleared his throat and asked about the status of the home equity loan. Miles admitted the lender had panicked, but claimed he could easily prepare a replacement package using a new, backdated capacity certificate. Diana replied that once the guardianship was approved in the morning, Ava's objections would become completely irrelevant anyway. Brian openly admitted the signatures had been practiced for weeks and explicitly told Kevin to destroy the basement binders immediately after receiving his payment. Each damning statement landed cleanly on the hidden police recording. Then, Diana noticed the tiny hesitation before Kevin answered. She stepped behind him, saw the sweat gathering at his collar, and slammed the laptop shut with a loud bang. "You are wearing a wire," she whispered. Brian lunged forward and grabbed the computer. Miles moved quickly toward the exit. Before anyone could escape, uniformed officers entered from the hallway and kitchen, weapons drawn, ordering all three to show their hands immediately. Diana froze in place. Miles dropped his leather case. Brian looked directly at me, not frightened yet, but absolutely furious that the person he considered completely useless had become the one variable he could not control. "You set up your own parents," he spat. "No," a calm voice answered from the kitchen doorway. "I did." Grandma Ava entered the room in a wheelchair, with Sergeant Ruiz walking beside her. She wore the same knitted gray cardigan from the locked room, but now her shoulders were perfectly straight. In her right hand, she held the medical alert. Pendant Diana had dismissed as an old woman's useless accessory. "You misunderstood one critical thing, Brian," Ava said, her voice echoing in the tense room. "Chloe was never my rescue plan. She was the witness I trusted to finish mine. This pendant was far more than a medical alert device." 6 months earlier, after Grandma noticed the very first unauthorized withdrawal from her savings, Leo had arranged a completely lawful recording system inside her home, linked to a secure cloud archive that received audio copies whenever she pressed the side button. She had captured Brian coaching her maliciously before a medical appointment. She had captured Diana threatening to call her senile if she contacted her friends. She had captured Kevin admitting he created the shell companies, and she had captured Miles explaining exactly how he could backdate the notarizations. The Blue Rose message had not begun the investigation. It had activated its final, public stage. Brian tried to speak over her, but Ruiz ordered him to remain silent. Diana pointed a shaking finger at Grandma. "After everything we sacrificed for you." Ava held her gaze, her eyes completely cold. "You did not sacrifice your lives, Diana. You tried to purchase better ones with mine." Miles immediately asked for an attorney, and Kevin followed the officer's instructions without resistance. Brian stared at me, trying to use his presence to restore the old hierarchy. "You were absolutely nothing before she filled your head with this, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping venom. "And you will be nothing when this is over." For years, those exact words would have sent me searching for achievements to place between us, like armor. But that night, I finally understood that proving my value to him would keep him at the center of my life forever. "When this is over, Brian," I said softly, "Grandma will be free. And that is more than enough." The investigation continued for months. Forensic accountants traced $426,000 in stolen, transferred, or pledged assets. Experts confirmed the forged signatures, and hospitals' records supported Grandma's account of isolation and restraint. The recordings established clear intent, while the basement files showed meticulous planning. Their attempt to call everything a misunderstanding collapsed because their own handwritten notes connected every lie. Kevin pleaded guilty to financial exploitation and falsifying business records. He surrendered his accounting license, returned the $38,000, cooperated fully with prosecutors, and received home confinement, probation, community service, and heavy restitution. Some relatives called him brave for turning, while others wanted him in prison. I saw a man who made profitable choices until the cost finally reached him, then finally made one honest choice. Whether I forgive him changes from day to day. Miles lost his commission and received prison time after investigators connected him to other estate fraud cases. Diana pleaded guilty shortly before trial and received 5 years. Brian went to trial, stubbornly claiming Grandma had gifted him everything and that I had manufactured the entire case out of spite. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. He was convicted of elder exploitation, forgery, attempted theft, unlawful restraint, and witness intimidation, receiving 8 years in a maximum security facility. The court officially voided the altered will, canceled the shell company's claims, and ordered assets purchased with Grandma's money sold for immediate restitution. Brian lost his position on a community foundation board. The Florida condominium vanished, and the luxury car was repossessed. The future they had designed with Grandma's savings became the exact means of repaying her. Before sentencing, I received letters from both of them. Diana wrote that families should not destroy one another over money. Brian wrote that I had finally proven I was capable, then shamelessly asked me to blame Diana for the plan. Even their apologies demanded something from me. Neither asked how Grandma's wrist had healed or what it felt like to be locked inside her own room. I did not answer. Grandma chose a small, accessible house near mine after touring 6 places. She resumed her weekly lunches with friends, hired an independent fiduciary, and created a fund helping older adults obtain independent legal reviews before signing powers of attorney. On the first anniversary of the distress call, she planted vibrant blue roses beside her front porch. I had always imagined myself as the abandoned daughter Ava rescued at 18. I now understood she had not saved me by controlling my choices. She had simply given me a safe, quiet place from which I could make them myself. That was why her plan worked. She did not ask me to become a weapon. She trusted me to remain disciplined when anger would have been far easier. People call what happened revenge, and I understand why. My parents mocked my work, built a case around my supposed uselessness, and watched those exact investigative skills completely dismantle everything they had stolen. Yet the most satisfying moment was not the handcuffs or the long sentences. It was watching Grandma unlock her new front door, place the key safely in her purse, and decide exactly who was welcome inside. Real revenge was not making them feel small. It was making sure they could never make her powerless again. I stopped explaining my career to relatives who had never cared to ask. I stopped treating professional achievement as an appeal for parental love, and I became far more attentive to the quiet signals families so easily overlook. A canceled visit, a changed account, an older person who looks towards someone else before answering. Valuable evidence often hides inside ordinary behavior, just as courage often hides inside the people others dismiss. So tell me honestly in the comments, if someone confessed only after being caught, would you forgive them, as I am still trying to forgive Kevin? And were Brian and Diana's sentences enough? Or should some betrayals cost people the very family they tried to control? Forgiveness may someday free me entirely from anger, but it will never require me to reopen the door. We truly appreciate you being part of this story today. Everything in this video is fictional and created only for storytelling, entertainment, and educational value. I want to remind you that after trauma, you do not need to rush your healing or pretend you're fine. You only need to keep choosing yourself, one single step at a time, until peace finally feels natural again.